Hello guys and gals, trying something a little bit different here, and I'm not sure if this is going to work or not. I'm using a different program to record my videos, so we're going to see if it works out well. Hopefully it does. So anyways, we'll be reading Pandora's Genes, which is a book by Kathryn Lance. This image is going to basically stay here, at least until we are going to go over the copyright information. It's copyright 1985 by Kathryn Lance, all rights reserved, but I have the artist's written permission to read this book on my YouTube channel. So anyways, we're going to get back into it. Let me turn it back to this. Okay, so one thing that's going to throw me off is I'm going to have to check every so often to see how long we've gone. But otherwise, in the last episode, the issue part, Evie and Lucky and there's one other girl, Lucille, I believe, along with the Fox Kit baby. They moved to the capital, and they're trying to find a cure for the woman's sickness and maybe determine who is the carrier through tests. And they're scientists and stuff. But this religious cult, the Traders, Traders, not Traitors, are trying to put a stop to anything that's science related. And anyways, a storm is brewing, and the principal is talking to Evie after not talking to her for a very long time. And we're going to get right into this. Let's see. Yeah. They sat and watched the rain for a few more minutes. The black clouds were rolling quickly to the east, leaving a shining eggshell white sky behind them. "Who would have thought you would come to the capital?" the principal said abruptly. "Who could have guessed your work would be so important?" His voice was hoarse, and again Evie was surprised at the sadness in it. But the next moment he leaped up and smiled. I must get on about my business," he said. "Thank you for the shelter." The summer heat was already turning the wet ground steamy as the principal strode down the marble steps, flanked by his men. Almost immediately the lines began to reform, and when Lucky and Lucille returned, the girls resumed their questioning. "How many brothers do you have?" Evie was asking a red-faced young woman. Her attention was so focused on recording the answers accurately she didn't realize anything was wrong until she was suddenly seized from behind. The woman she had been interviewing screamed, and the patients scattered in terror. Strong, thick arms gripped her tightly around the chest, pinning her own arms to her sides. Behind her she could hear Lucky whimpering. All at once a clean-shaven man with curly blonde hair leaped onto the table and began shouting to the crowd, who had been prevented from fleeing by armed men at the entrance. Daniel and his men were fighting, but they seemed badly outnumbered. Over their yells, and the blond man shouted, "Do you know where you are? This is a temple to science. These women are scientists. They are asking you to contaminate yourselves. They are asking you to join in their unholy crusade to spread their evils of the change." Many of the clients stopped trying to escape and turned to look at him. Evie heard murmurs of anger beginning to spread. "Don't believe their lies," the man shouted. "Tear up their notes. Destroy their instruments. Don't let them cause another change." He took the day's stack of filled-in questionnaires and ripped them to pieces, scattering them about the room. "No!" cried Evie. She struggled with her captor, trying to pull herself free. Now some of the members of the crowd, as if infected, had begun tearing the remaining notes and smashing the wooden instruction board and instruments. Lucky was sobbing, pleading with the man who held her. "Don't listen to this man," Evie called out. "He is ignorant. This is your only chance for survival." A rough hand was clapped over her mouth, cutting off her words. Now the crowd began to turn to her. She heard someone shout, "Godless scientists." For the first time since this had started, Evie was afraid. She shrank back, seeing the hatred and madness on the faces of the men and women she had only recently been trying to help. She struggled desperately, but her captors only gripped her more tightly. A fire was now flickering in front of the statue, the crowd feeding it scraps of leaf paper and wood. "Kill the scientists," came the cry. Two large, dirty men with crazed looks in their faces began walking towards her, and Evie shut her eyes in terror. The next moment she was released so suddenly that she pitched forward onto her hands and knees. She turned and saw the man who had captured her lying on his side, his head cut nearly from his neck. Above him stood the principal, his face white as ash, his features twisted in rage. He was shouting orders to armed men who had appeared around him. Before Evie could move or say anything, the principal pulled her to her feet and pushed her towards another man. "Guard her with your life," he cried, and turned and matched swords with an invader. The principal's man held Evie with one arm, the other hand on his sword. He pulled her close to a pillar away from the fighting. The principal was shouting like a madman, his sword everywhere. As if in a dream, Evie saw blood spurt from the chest of one man, the shoulder of another. The sharp sound of metal on metal mingled with screams of anger and fear. The man who was guarding her took a blow on his forearm and staggered a moment, but he did not let go of her. A moment later, the principal struck down the attacker. Nearly as suddenly as it had begun, the noise and confusion had disappeared, except for some distant shouts outside the building and the moans of injured lying on the slippery floor. The principal, his tunic splattered with blood, his face dark and coarsened, stood in the center of the clinic, sheathing his sword. Daniel, bleeding badly from wounds on his head and thigh, approached him, then opened his hand in a gesture of appeal. He was, Evie saw, weeping. "It was men in my guard that let this happen," he said. "They must have been spies or converts." "It was your responsibility," the principal said, his voice as tight as his lips. "I can no longer trust you." Daniel sank to his knees. "I resign my commission at once," he said. The principal struck him across the face, knocking him to the floor. "You haven't the right. I relieve you of it. You will be punished." The guard had released her, and Evie realized it was over. She stood dumbly looking at Daniel, who was slowly struggling to his feet, his face streaked with tears and blood. Then she remembered. "Lucky," she said, starting to look around for her friend. "She's dead," said the principal. His voice had become very quiet. Evie looked at him, not understanding at first. Then she heard a howl of mourning and recognized Lucille's voice. "They would have killed you too," the principal said. "It was only luck that my mount went lame. I would have been outside the Capitol when this happened." Evie stood a moment in shock. "Our notes," she said, "all destroyed. Instruments, notes, records, all gone. All that work for nothing." Evie felt cold. She looked at the floor, slippery with blood, and at the overturned table. The principal's men had begun covering the bodies. She started to turn to where Lucky had been just before the attack. The principal moved quickly and stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. She looked at him. The dark curls stuck to his forehead with sweat, and felt she had known him her whole life. "You're a brave girl, Evie," he said. The words pierced the cloak of shock she had pulled over herself, and she began to tremble. The principal pulled her head to his chest and pulled her shoulder while she sobbed into his tunic. We'll quickly check here, see how long it's been. 9 minutes, okay. The meeting room was smoky. The fire wasn't drawing properly, and the principal repeatedly cleared his throat as he talked. The old woman, incredibly still alive, lay in her room, too ill to be here. Katha was pacing the polished floor, irritation showing in every line of her face and every gesture. "I say, it's too dangerous," she repeated. "We've already lost one scientist. Are you trying to destroy us?" The principal looked just as annoyed as Katha, but spoke calmly. "It will be safe as I can possibly make it," he said, "but the real work can't go ahead as long as the leader of the traitors is at large. He must be stopped." "Let your own men stop him, then," said Katha. "I refuse to risk any more women." The principal took a deep breath, and then another. When he resumed, he spoke very distinctly, as if explaining something to a child. "I agree that the ultimate solution is to have my men do all the testing, but it will take time to train them. As you yourself pointed out, in the meantime, it is vital for the testing to resume, both to preserve the work already done and to lay a trap." Katha shook her head impatiently. She walked over to the fireplace, then squatted and peered into it as if the answer to the dispute was responsible for clogging the flue. Evie watched from a cushioned chair opposite the windows. Sighed. She thought that the principal and Katha were a great deal alike. Neither seemed able to give in, even on a small point. In this case, though, the principal was right. The screening must continue. Katha was a good leader, but she didn't fully understand the importance of the scientific work. She was far more interested in the logistics of running a community. She could probably, Evie realized suddenly, lead the district every bit as well as the principal. Katha stood again and, her back to the smoking fire, began to speak. "You are the principal. You control all the wealth, the resources of the district. I can't believe that you are unable to capture the leader of the traitors." Nevertheless, I can't," the principal shouted, then again breathed deeply and went on. "My men arrest every traitor they find preaching openly. We have yet to gain usable information from any of them. We can't discover anything about this man. I've posted a reward for him. The man who catches the traitor leader will have more metal than I do. My men bring in traitor after traitor, some of them even claiming to be the Messiah, but always they're the wrong man. Perhaps your men are more in sympathy with the traitors than you suspect," Katha said. "That's just it," he said, now standing himself. "That's it exactly. Even my generals are beginning to think this man is somehow supernatural. It's gotten to the point where I can't be sure of anyone. The only way I'll slow the spread of this religion is to capture their Messiah and prove he's just as human as the rest of us. And the only way I can capture him is to draw him into the open again, to the clinic. What you just said proves that your plan isn't safe. As you just admitted, you can't be certain whom among your men is a traitor, spy, and who isn't." The principal looked weary. That's not altogether true. I have a few close aides that I trust absolutely, and they will guard the clinic." He sat again and went on. "Here is all I ask. Let me have 2 or 3 scientists for just enough time to train a small group of my men in the testing procedures. 2 days a week, only we will operate the clinic. If the trap doesn't work after a few weeks, I'll abandon the idea." Evie thought Katha looked very confident as she shook her head, her long, broad hair sweeping across her back. "I can't ask any of my women to take that risk," she said. Evie curled her hands into fists. Katha hadn't even listened. She was opposing the principal just for the sake of opposition. It was as if winning her point were more important to her than saving the human race. Evie closed her eyes a moment, remembering the screams, the slippery feel of blood on the floor, and the smell of death. She remembered Lucky, her enthusiasm, and sparkling eyes. She remembered how she had looked in death. With all that energy stilled, she swallowed, then opened her eyes and stood. "I'll do it," she said. The principal and Katha both turned and gaped at her. Gunda half rose. "Evie, you don't have to," she continued, fighting to keep her voice calm. "I know I don't have to, but I know how important it is. And I've been to the capital. I've already seen the worst thing that could happen. I think it would be easier for me than for anyone else." There was a moment of silence, and Hilda stood. "I'll go too," she said. "Evie can't train the men by herself." 2 more women rose, including Lucille. "Lucky belonged to all of us as a daughter of the garden," she said quietly, "but to me she was above all my child. I know she would want me to carry on the work, so her death will not be lost. I will go too. Lucille had lost weight since Lucky's death and had become rather taciturn than ever. But Evie thought tonight she was beginning to look herself again, with a hint of Lucky's sparkling animation in her gaunt face. There are 4 volunteers, said Gunda in the silence. Katha stood in the center of the room, a frozen statue of fury, looking from one woman to another. The principal's face was unreadable. Evie prayed that he would hold his temper now and keep his triumph hidden. I forbid this, said Katha. You can't do that, said Hilda. And you know it. If it comes to a council vote, we will go. Don't split the garden. You know what we've been working for all these years. It has to be done. Katha stood still another moment, her entire body rigid. Evie sensed that she would kill the principal if she could, and that her feelings came from something more than the present dispute. But she wouldn't split the garden. She crossed to the window and sat. Very well, she said, but for safety, I insist that your own guards go along. The principal nodded. That's an excellent idea. Your soldiers can be trusted completely, and I know they're well trained. Evie relaxed. The principal was not going to provoke Katha further, and was being generous besides. She felt a sense of exultation floating lightly above her fear. She looked at the principal and saw gratitude in his eyes. The 3 scientists and 6 soldiers from the garden were given rooms in a wing of the principal's own house, at the principal's strict orders that they were not allowed beyond the walled yards, and went outside only armed and under guard. Evie, Hilda, and Lucille began immediately to train 7 of the principal's men, most of whom had been recruited from among his literacy teachers and healers. An exception was Daniel, the former general, who had become subdued and sober since the traitor attack and seemed determined to atone for his tragic mistake. Although all the men could read and write, none were trained in the mathematical skills they would need, and Evie found that teaching them these skills was consuming most of her time. She enjoyed the classes, which were conducted in a thickly carpeted parlor with polished wooden furniture and gently curving walls. The principal's men were were eager to learn, and good-natured, laughing more easily than did the women of the garden. They treated the women kindly and with respect, and fussed a great deal over Baby, who generally observed the proceedings from atop the mantelpiece, her water-colored eyes alert and surprised-looking. Daniel in particular was so solicitous and took the first opportunity to beg forgiveness of both Lucille and Evie, pledging that he would protect them with his life. He not only studied harder than the other men, he familiarized himself with all stages of the testing, from questioning to the follow-up statistical work. He had a better basic education than the other men and learned quickly. Evie was glad that the principal had forgiven him to the extent of allowing him to work on the project, though she understood that he was no longer allowed in the principal's presence. After the attack, she had been afraid, seeing the principal's face and remembering what he had once told her about men who betrayed a trust, that Daniel would be imprisoned or worse. Evie remembered the way that Daniel used to look at Lucky and wondered if he missed her the way she did Zach, if he was working on the project in dedication to Lucky's memory, as Evie had become a daughter of the garden in dedication to Zach's. Pardon me just a sec. 19 minutes in. Okay. While training proceeded, the principal was having readers go about the capital and into some of the nearby towns to announce that the testing and birth control program would resume in some weeks, and posting the dates, the place, and the time. Evie tried not to think about how soon it was, but concentrated instead on her teaching and on reading books taken from the thousands in the principal's library. Evie loved the principal's house, which, more than any building she had seen, seemed to reflect life before the change. Although much was as shabby as anywhere in the district, still, The furnishings, hanging portraits, and carpets were well preserved and more carefully constructed than anything made since the change. She had her own room here, an unimaginable, an, an unimaginable luxury. It had a desk, bureau, bed, and 2 chairs, and best of all, high windows made of glass through which she gazed for hours, watching the teeming life in the streets. She had assumed that living in this house she would see the principal often, but in fact they scarcely met, and she only occasionally caught glimpses of him through her window as he strode impatiently about his grounds. She felt that she knew him better than anyone else in her life, better even than Zack. Yet it was because of Zack and her vow to protect his memory that she could never feel completely comfortable with the principal. Her fear of him had disappeared, but the secret of her origin and of Zack's betrayal would hang between them always. The day that the trap was first to be set, Evie woke before the sun. She sat up and looked out the window at the dawning light. At the foot of her bed, Baby was whimpering and twitching in her sleep. The little fox cat was pregnant for the third time in as many years, but had yet to deliver live kittens, although Evie would feel far safer having her pet with her at the clinic. She had decided not to subject her to the possible dangers there, and the thought of what might happen, she felt a tightening in her stomach and throat. At a final meeting the previous evening, the principal had explained that he did not expect the attack to come on the first day, but that they must all be prepared for the possibility. The clinic would be heavily guarded by the soldiers from the garden and the principal's most trusted men. In addition, among the legitimate citizens coming for testing would be more of the principal's men posing as husbands to women for hire, who were to be well paid for their risk. At the first sign of trouble, Evie, Hilda, and Lucille were to crouch under the tables, where they would be guarded. When the meeting ended, the principal had approached Evie and taken her hand. "Don't be afraid," he told her. "I promise you we'll be safe." She had returned to her room with her heart pounding from fear and from his touch. Checking. 22 minutes, okay. In the end, it happened on the first day, and it happened very quickly. Evie had become so busy with her work that she had forgotten the danger. The table shook, causing her to spoil a leaf paper, and she looked up from her writing, annoyed to see standing before her a handsome young man with curly yellow hair. He was bearded, and she was so surprised that all she could think at first was how familiar he looked. It was a moment before she recognized him as the leader of the fatal attack last year. He smiled and looked directly into her eyes, an openness that reminded Evie of the principal. He pulled a short, sharp dagger from his sleeve and held it so that she could see it, then said, "Don't say a word. Pick up your things and come with me." From the corner of her eye, Evie could see that the other women, including the guards, were too busy to notice anything, and the clinic had become so crowded that she was not sure where the nearest of the principal's men were. Her legs shaking, she stood, then gathered papers in her hand and threw them at him. She saw him step back in surprise, and then she screamed. Instantly, the room filled with armed men and women. The party of traitors was so badly outnumbered that there was little fighting. The blond man, seeing that he had been trapped, stood there. He was at the principal. Stood where he was, as the principal's men surrounded him. "That's him. That's the man," Evie repeated again and again, pointing. She was dizzy, and she thought for a moment she would be sick. "He's the one that killed Lucky." Strong hands took a hold of her shoulders and squeezed, then released her. She turned to see the principal behind her. "It's over," he said. "We have him." He approached the prisoner. "Are you the one they call the traitor Messiah?" The man nodded. "You finally caught me," he said. "Yosh, no," cried one of the men, but the blond man shook his head and went on, calm and proud. "I've always known that this would happen," he said. He looked at the principal directly. "You will kill me, I know that, but you cannot kill my ideas. The truth will live." "The truth is what you filthy traitors are poisoning," said the principal. The traitor shrugged. "The seeds have been planted in the capital. Nothing you can do will stop us." "Oh, can stop us." The man was was as calm and certain as if he had been peering through the window into the future. The principal had told Evie and the others last night what would become of the traitor leader if he was captured. He would be questioned under torture, then bound to a machine body without food and water until he died. His body would stay there at the base of the great tower until it had turned to bones. It was the most horrible death Evie could imagine, but looking at the strangely intense face of the young leader, she was sure that he would face it calmly. The principal was ordering his men to take the traitors to his prison, his voice sounding as strong and confident as that of the traitor Messiah. But he turned to look at his prisoner. Evie thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty on his face, a tiny hint of fear. Chapter 5. Though it was early morning, the principal could already feel the sun hot on his neck as he stood outside the gate, waiting to be admitted to the new garden. Nearly 2 years after she had told him she was sick, the old woman was at last dying. He had set out immediately, and as soon as he received her message, his own emotions so confused he didn't know quite what he felt. He could not imagine why she had summoned him. She had long since made it clear that he was no more welcome at her deathbed than in her life. Whatever her motive, it must be important to her, and therefore undoubtedly important to him and their shared concerns. Let me check. Okay, we're going to have to stop it here. I hope you like this new format. If you do, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, we've been reading Pandora's Genes by Kathryn Lance. If you like this book, this is part of a trilogy. The other books are Pandora's Children, which is the second book, and Pandora's Promise, which is the third book. If you want these books, then I'm sure they're probably for sale at most of the big book resellers. Anyways, if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below, along with a link to our Discord server. Also, I believe that's all. Thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.